Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Voyage of a Vessel. My name is Danielle Wensauer, and I'm with Transport Canada, Marine Safety and Security in the Pacific region. I'm grateful to be speaking to you today as a first-generation settler on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. It's these territories that inspire us, and they're the reason that we're here together today to talk about Canada's marine safety system. I'm so glad you could join us to learn about how Canada works to prevent incidents from happening in our waters. I'm here with three other co-presenters, and I'll just take a few moments to introduce them briefly. Scott Rear is with the Canadian Coast Guard in the Marine Communications and Traffic Services Western Region. Scott started his career with the Canadian Coast Guard in 2004 as an MCTS officer in Vancouver and moved to the Victoria Centre in 2016. He is responsible for procedures and policies, and his portfolio includes the Marine Mammal Desk, international meetings with the US Coast Guard, and has worked with the Vancouver-Fraser Port Authority on many projects. Currently, Scott is working on the radar refurbishment project. Next, we have Kevin Obermeyer, who is the CEO of the Pacific Pilotage Authority, a position he has held for 16 years. He holds a Master Mariner Unlimited license, which basically means he is certified to sail as captain on any size ship. Kevin spent 15 years sailing the globe before coming ashore to work in the maritime sector. Finally, Eggy Klosterburr is the Deputy Harbour Master and Manager of Marine Operations for the Vancouver-Fraser Port Authority. Eggy leads the navigation and hydrographic team to ensure the safe and efficient movement of marine traffic and cargo within the Port of Vancouver's jurisdiction. Eggy began his career as navigation officer on cargo ships and cruise vessels before shifting his focus to the commercial shipping industry. For more than 25 years, Eggy worked for various international shipping companies, and then in 2015, he joined the Vancouver-Fraser Port Authority. Eggy holds degrees in maritime sciences and management technology from the Netherlands. Today, the four of us will be telling you a story about how the marine safety system works in Canada. And let me start by saying that the marine safety system is highly complex, integrated, and regulated. And hopefully today we can unravel some of that complexity and show you the layers of cooperation and redundancy that demonstrate just how integrated and regulated it really is. So, we have two different ships that we're going to talk about. The first part of our story is an inbound journey of a bulk cargo ship as it makes its way across the Pacific to the Port of Vancouver, to a terminal on the Fraser River. The second part will be about an outbound tanker carrying oil. We call this a laden tanker, leaving the Trans Mountain Terminal in Burnaby. The reason for the two types of ships is to give you the broadest overview of all the rules that are in place in the Salish Sea, and particularly the differences between a regular cargo ship and a laden tanker. The cast of characters in our story are the main agencies responsible for regulating marine shipping in Canada. At the top, the International Maritime Organization, or the IMO, provides a global system for shipping, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But first, we'll start here in Canada. Transport Canada is the lead federal department that administers the legislation governing marine safety. Transport Canada also has an enforcement role for inspecting vessels in Canada, especially those which may have defects. We also rely on other key partners to help us make sure the system is safe and efficient. The Canadian Coast Guard performs many of the operational aspects of the system while a vessel is navigating in Canadian waters. They're the eyes and the ears on the water, and the ones who make the system work at sea. The Pacific Pilotage Authority and the pilots who work for them have the local waterway expertise. These pilots board a vessel to advise and help the ship's master navigate safely through our waters. And Canada's port authorities have extra powers to manage shipping traffic within their boundaries. And of course, there are other partners that help out depending on the situation. For example, Indigenous communities have knowledge, expertise, and mariners at sea in the local waters of their traditional territories. Environment and Climate Change Canada and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans provide scientific advice about species and water quality, especially in the event of an incident. And response organizations, such as Western Canada Response Organization, respond to oil spills on the polluter's behalf. So, before we start our voyage, I'd like to take a moment to look at the international framework for marine transportation, because shipping is a global activity. That's maybe an obvious statement, but it's important because it has implications for how shipping is regulated in Canada. To make sure that each country doesn't make its own set of rules, maritime nations have agreed on a number of international conventions, which set out common rules that apply to all vessels. Canada is one of 172 member states that make up the International Maritime Organization, which is the global standard-setting authority for the safety, security, and environmental performance of international shipping. As an international industry, shipping can only run effectively if we all agree to follow the same rules. Canada is signatory to nearly 50 international maritime conventions, 3 of which are particularly important. The first one is the Safety of Life at Sea Convention, or SOLAS, which governs vessel construction, life-saving equipment, and safe operations of vessels. The first version of this convention was passed in 1914 in response to the sinking of the Titanic. The International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships, known as MARPOL, sets limits on discharges such as sewage, air emissions, garbage, and other pollutants. And thirdly, the standards for training, certification, and watchkeeping set out the requirements for how seafarers are trained and certified. Canada has adopted these conventions into domestic law through the Canada Shipping Act 2001, which is the primary legislation governing marine transportation in Canada. Countries that share common waters, like the Pacific Ocean, have also come together under a number of international Memoranda of Understanding, or MOUs, to deal with the issue of substandard shipping. Canada is a member of the Paris MOU, which covers the Atlantic Ocean, and the Tokyo MOU, which covers the Pacific Ocean. These MOUs set out the framework for a standardized ship inspection regime called port state control. So let's talk for a moment about the difference between a port state and a flag state. A port state is a country whose ports are visited by international ships. By contrast, a flag state is a country where a ship is registered. So Canada is the flag state for domestic vessels such as tugs, fishing boats, and passenger vessels like BC ferries. We don't have many foreign trading vessels that are flagged in Canada. Under the port state control system, when foreign flagged ships come to the Port of Vancouver, Transport Canada inspectors may board the vessel to make sure it meets international and domestic regulations. The inspectors take note of any deficiencies or irregularities, and vessels that do not meet prescribed standards are detained until their deficiencies are corrected. One of the most important aspects of this system is that member nations agree to share inspection information to target higher risk ships or poor performers, so that these ships have nowhere to hide. Port state control has been very effective at keeping substandard vessels out of our waters since it came into practice about 40 years ago. To illustrate the effectiveness of this system of continuous improvement at the international level, the blue bar in the graph here shows that the number of oil spills around the world has decreased steadily over the last 40 years, from an average of almost 80 spills per year in the 1970s to just slightly more than 6 spills per year in the 2010s. We've achieved this record despite increasing oil shipments over the same period. This is shown by the red line indicating growth in tanker trade. This track record of improvement is a direct result of the IMO conventions that I just mentioned. So now that we've taken a brief look at the international marine safety regime, I'd like to introduce you to the main characters of our story. The inbound cargo vessel is the MV Salinas. Salinas is a 21,000-ton bulk cargo ship, similar to those which occupy most of the anchorages in Burrard Inlet. The ship is now sailing from Osaka, Japan, to Fraser Surrey docks to load grain. Now, this isn't a hypothetical visit. The Salinas made this voyage in December 2017. Our outbound vessel is the tanker Aqualiter, which is now preparing to get underway. Aqualiter is a bulk liquid tanker, typical of those which operate from Westridge Terminal in Burnaby. The ship actually made this trip as well, and the photos are the ship when it transited through the Vancouver Harbour to sea, escorted by tugs. So, we join the inbound vessel Salinas mid-ocean on its way to Canada at a speed of 15 to 20 knots, which is typical for a vessel of this size. The dotted red line delineates Canada's exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, measured 200 nautical miles from a baseline outside Haida Gwaii and Vancouver Island. The waters inside the EEZ are where the Canada Shipping Act and environmental regulations begin to apply. The waters outside the line are the high seas, where international conventions apply, but which no single country controls. So before entering the EEZ, the vessel must take 4 important actions. The first one is to submit a 96-hour report. The second one is to manage its ballast water. The third one is to switch to low sulfur fuel. And finally, the fourth is to file a 24-hour report. The vessel's owner must also ensure that a contract is in place with a certified response organization. And for the West Coast, this is Western Canada Marine Response Corporation, or WCMRC for short. So, the first action Salinas takes is to file a 96-hour report when it is about 4 days away, or approximately 1,500 nautical miles offshore. In the report, the vessel must provide a suite of information, some of which includes, for example, the names and certifications of its crew, what it's carrying for cargo, whether there are any dangerous goods on board, its destination, proposed route, and estimated time of arrival, whether it has any deficiencies, and its last 10 ports of call. Now, the 96-hour report is a security requirement, and it came about following 9/11. It allows Canada to conduct a security scan and threat assessment. This report is submitted to the Marine Security Operations Centre, or MSOC, which is a bunker on the Esquimalt military base. MSOC partners include Transport Canada, the Department of National Defence, CBSA, RCMP, and Coast Guard, all of whom collect intelligence from all over the world to conduct assessments for threats ranging from infectious viruses to human and drug trafficking. The second action our vessel must take is to manage its ballast water, which is water carried on board to manage the ship's stability. Depending on how much cargo it has, the Salinas may have taken on ballast water before leaving Japan. To prevent the introduction of invasive species and protect global biodiversity, Canada has long required vessels to exchange their ballast water in the middle of the ocean before entering Canada's exclusive economic zone. It works like this. The ship would have first taken on ballast water at the port in Japan to stabilize it for its journey across the Pacific. This Japanese coastal water might contain organisms that are not native to Canada's west coast. And so by exchanging the ballast water in the high seas, the ship would take on relatively clean, highly saline water, which is safer to release in another port. In June 2021, so less than a year ago, Canada strengthened its ballast water regulations. The new regulations mark a transition from the traditional method of exchanging ballast water in mid-ocean to the use of modern ballast water management systems, which clean ballast water of organisms before release, a bit like how sewage is treated. Canadian ships traveling abroad and those coming into Canada from abroad are now required to meet the new standards by 2024. So, having safely exchanged or managed its ballast water, the Salinas is now 1 day away from reaching its destination. When the vessel enters Canada's exclusive economic zone, the third action it will take is to limit its air emissions. Emission control areas, or known as ECAs, are established by the International Maritime Organization to limit air emissions from ships in coastal areas. In North America's ECA, which spans the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone all around North America, you see that in green on the screen. The Salinas must burn fuel or scrub its exhaust to emit a maximum of 0.1% sulfur content. By contrast, outside ECA, the Salinas may emit up to 0.5% sulfur content. Now, it's worth noting that these limits on emissions are relatively new. The 0.1% North American ECA came into force in 2015, while the 0.5% limit in the high seas has been around only since 2020. Before that, ships burned what's called heavy fuel oil with a sulfur content around 3.5%. So today, the vast majority of ships are using very low sulfur fuel oil to comply with the new limit. Once it reaches Canadian waters, our vessel Salinas may also be tracked by the National Aerial Surveillance Program, or NASP. NASP aircraft are capable of detecting very small discharges of pollutants and fly at altitudes similar to those of commercial aircraft, so vessels don't know they're being watched. Canada is well known for this surveillance capacity, which acts as a strong deterrent to illegal discharges and plays an important role in response and cleanup operations. But back to our vessel. As the Salinas nears Canadian waters, it'll soon be taking the fourth action, which is to file a 24-hour report with the Canadian Coast Guard. Now that it's entering Coast Guard's area of oversight, I will hand the story over to my colleague, Scott Rear, to take us through the next leg of the voyage. Scott.
Thank you, Danielle. Good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Scott Rear. I'm with the Canadian Coast Guard Marine Communications and Traffic Services Program. On this slide, you can see that the Canadian Coast Guard contributes to the marine safety system through 6 main programs: Marine Communications and Traffic Services, Search and Rescue via the Joint Rescue Coordination Center, the Fleet via the Regional Operations Center, the Marine Security Operations Center, Aids to Navigation, and Environmental Response. As you can see as well, MCTS is a conduit for much of the information the Coast Guard uses to work with our partners, improve operations, and manage our day-to-day activities. Our focus for this presentation is prevention and the linkages between the Mariner, MCTS, Transport Canada, the Pacific Pilotage Association, and the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. Marine Communications and Traffic Service is comparable to Air Traffic Control and 911. The Air Traffic Control section is similar to our vessel traffic services provided at both Prince Rupert and Victoria, and 911 is comparable to our Coast Guard radio services. As Danielle mentioned, we are the eyes and ears of the coast. The Victoria Centre itself has 10 MCTS officers on watch at a time, 24/7, as well as a marine mammal desk. It is the largest centre in Canada, and its coverage area, as you can see on the graphic, is Juan de Fuca through to the Salish Sea and the inside waters to the north end of Vancouver Island. Prince Rupert MCTS has 5 officers on watch 24/7 as well. They have the largest geographical area in the country for marine communications and traffic services, and their coverage area is the west coast of Vancouver Island down to 48 degrees north, which is US waters, to the north end of Vancouver Island and all the way to the Alaska border. Prince Rupert is very important. It is the first point of contact for vessels inbound for all Canadian and some US ports under the Cooperative Vessel Traffic Management System, and there'll be more on this later. Marine Communications and Traffic Service officers have several skills and attributes that they have to develop at their time at the college. They need to work effectively under time and emotional pressures. They need to speak with vessels in distress, both commercial and pleasure. They need to provide accurate and timely relay of these communications, as well as logging all these communications. They need to analyze vessel movements and predict those outcomes, adapt to ever-evolving situations, and as we're going to see here, work as a team with multiple agencies. As mentioned, they spent up to 6 months at the Canadian Coast Guard College, and then up to a year working on position under an on-the-job instructor. For a comparative RCMP training, recruits spend 6 months in Regina at depot, and then they undertake a localized training as well. So now we're going to go back to the Salinas. The vessel now files a 24-hour report, and under the Canada Shipping Act 2001 VTS regs and the zone regulations, vessels 500 gross registered tons are required to submit a VTS offshore report 24 hours prior to entering Canadian waters. This report focuses on safety and covers up to over 20 items. The most important items are position, course, speed, the last and next port, intended route, and ETA to our zone boundary. Whether they have any dangerous cargo, defects or deficiencies, any threat of discharge of a pollutant, and to ensure that all various mandatory certifications are up to date. This report is typically submitted when the vessel is 300 to 350 nautical miles offshore via their Inmarsat satellite communication system to the Prince Rupert MCTS Centre. This centre covers the offshore area of the BC coast, and the officer will screen the report, flag any issues, and inform the Transport Canada Marine Safety Inspector if necessary. In this situation, the master reported that their Inmarsat C antenna experienced a power failure due to a lightning strike. The Inmarsat C terminal is a communication system between a mobile and land-based station and carried on board, and it uses satellites around the world to communicate. Vessels have multiple communication systems, so they are still able to send messages even though there was damages to this antenna. A Transport Canada Marine Safety Inspector would have been advised, and they would analyze the defect to determine the impact to safety. They look for concerns with hull, integrity, propulsion, machinery, and navigational equipment. And in this case, the safety inspector applied the following restrictions. The master is to provide confirmation that the Inmarsat C terminal is repaired in Vancouver, and all communications and rectification reports are to be sent to Marine Communications and Traffic Services. Had the vessel reported an issue that affected its operation or stability in a more serious manner, then agencies such as Transport Canada, the U.S. Coast Guard Environmental Response, Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, and the Pacific Pilotage Association would all be consulted, and the situation would be discussed, and there could be a mitigation plan developed, such as an escort tug or other directions imposed. In this case, a Marine Communication and Traffic Services officer grants a clearance for the vessel to enter Canadian waters and instructs the vessel to call Prince Rupert traffic on VHF Channel 74 at 126 west longitude, which is approximately 50 nautical miles offshore. Prince Rupert MCTS will start tracking the vessel via its Automated Identification System, or AIS, once it reaches approximately 100 to 150 nautical miles offshore through a network of communication towers that are established on the west side of Vancouver Island. Vessels call Prince Rupert traffic on VHF radio at 126 west longitude, like I said, which is approximately 50 nautical miles offshore. Here again, the MCTSO asks if there is any threat of pollution or discharge of pollution or any defects and deficiencies. This is the first time we've spoken to the master, and he reports the Inmarsat C antenna experienced a power failure, just as reported on the 24-hour report. As there are no further defects reported, the vessel is allowed to continue its voyage into Juan de Fuca. On occasions at this point, there are additional defects that are reported. With the vessel still being approximately 50 nautical miles offshore, it allows Transport Canada and other agencies, again, to formulate a mitigation strategy if required. The defect information is then shared with the Pacific Pilotage Authority to ensure pilots are aware prior to boarding the vessel. The report is also shared with the U.S. Coast Guard Seattle Traffic and Vancouver Fraser Port Authority, and this is part of the linkage we spoke about of the marine safety system earlier in the PowerPoint. As a vessel approaches Juan de Fuca, a shore-based radar from Mount Ozard and Cape Flattery is used to track all vessel movements, and this is a screenshot of the equipment located at Prince Rupert MCTS Centre. As you can see, there are several vessel tags on this screen. The circular targets are those required by radar. The triangular targets are those acquired by AIS. And we also have color coordination, so vessels that are yellow are going to be westbound and southbound. Vessels that are white are going to be northbound and eastbound. The MCTSO analyzes the vessel's route and provides valuable information to the master, such as waterway information, including navigational aid status, navigational warnings, fisheries information, and any other information that may impact its transit. It also confirms the pilot boarding time and provides a traffic advisory of other vessels that may be of consequence on its route. Important functions of the MCTSO is to ensure that the vessels pass each other safely and that specific passing arrangements are followed through with. Approaching the 12 nautical mile limit, the vessel is now going to be required to call us at what are mandatory calling in points, and these are the numbers you see on the screen. At every occasion, when the vessel approaches one of these calling in points, the MCTSO goes through the same analysis process for pre-planning and provide an advisory of what the vessel is going to see at that calling in point and up into the next calling in point. At this case, the vessel is approaching the entrance to Juan de Fuca. The MCTSO will then send an electronic handoff to Seattle traffic 1 hour prior to entering Seattle traffic's zone, which contains the vessel's particulars and the information on the defect. I'm now going to speak a bit to the CVTS, or Cooperative Vessel Traffic Management Services Agreement. This is a formal international agreement signed between Canada and the United States in 1979, just over 40 years ago. It is a unique agreement in the world in that it provides for VTS management in a shared waterway. It was decided years ago that having outbound vessels in Juan de Fuca, speaking to a Canadian vessel traffic regulator, and inbound vessels in Juan de Fuca, speaking to a U.S. traffic regulator, did not promote the safe and efficient movement of traffic. Under the CVTS agreement, as you can see on the screen, 3 zones were developed. The diagonal zone is a Prince Rupert MCTS zone, and they handle all offshore communications for both Canadian and U.S. waters. The green area is operated by Seattle traffic, and again, they regulate both Canadian and U.S. waters in that area. And the crosshatch zone is going to be operated by Victoria traffic, and again, they will be regulating. The interesting fact with this is that with northbound vessels, they're going to be regulated by Canadian regulators using U.S. laws in Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass, whereas southbound vessels are going to be regulated by Canadian regulators using Canadian law. So these centers exchange vessel information on a daily basis with each transit. The vessels follow the traffic separation schemes, which are mandatory, and those are kind of like the traffic lanes of the sea that you can see on the screen. Both Coast Guards meet 4 times a year to discuss procedures, marine occurrences, interoperability, and common issues in Juan de Fuca, Harrow Strait, Boundary Pass, and the approaches to Juan de Fuca. Prince Rupert instructs the vessel, in this case the Salinas, to call Seattle traffic on their VHF radio when it's abeam Cape Flattery. Seattle now monitors the transit using AIS and shore-based radars throughout the strait, and Seattle traffic will confirm the boarding time for Broachy Ledge, just south of Victoria, and communicate it to the Pacific Pilotage Authority and the Canadian Coast Guard if it is significantly different than what they reported before. 1 hour prior to Race Rock, Seattle traffic sends an electronic handoff back to Victoria with all the vessel particulars, including the noted defect. The vessel continues to follow the traffic separation scheme and turns north at the Port Angeles Rotary and will check in with Victoria Traffic. Victoria Traffic will monitor the vessel's transit using AIS and radar, and provide traffic advisories as it passes each of the calling in points. As this vessel proceeds on her voyage, MCTS will continue to monitor the transit until the vessel is safely alongside its berth. The Marine pilot will board the vessel off Broachy Ledge, and here I'll hand the presentation to Kevin to discuss a pilot's role on board.
Thanks, Scott, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kevin Obermeyer, and I'm the CEO of the Pacific Pilotage Authority. We are a financially self-sufficient federal crown corporation tasked with the provision and administration of a marine pilotage operation on the west coast of Canada in the interests of the safety of navigation. We get our authority to operate from a piece of legislation known as the Pilotage Act of 1972, which was recently amended. Our area of operation is unique in the world and covers the entire red area and small green area in the Fraser River. Briefly, every vessel over 350 gross tons, which is about 150 feet, requires a licensed marine pilot on board in order to operate in the compulsory pilotage areas off our coast. While there are exceptions for Canadian and US flagged vessels, this is the basis of piloting requirements on the West Coast. The licensed pilot has the conduct of the vessel while in compulsory pilotage orders, and this means that the pilot is solely responsible for the safe navigation of the vessel and will give courses to steer and engine orders to get the vessel safely from open water to berthing it alongside a dock. The BC Coast pilots are licensed for the red area and are a private company contracting their services to us, and presently number 118 licensed pilots with 6 apprentices. Fraser River have 9 employee pilots, our employees who manage the piloting in the green sections, namely the Fraser River. Given the area of coverage, we have an amazing accident-free assignment rate. It's usually well over the 99.9% and is presently at 99.96% accident-free. And on average, we do about 12,500 moves a year. Now, this accident-free success does not come by chance. It's by rigid adherence to regulations and policies, ensuring that we have highly trained and very experienced mariners piloting the many ships around our coast. From the time a pilot gets taken on as apprentice to the time they retire, there are formal training courses required on an ongoing basis. On average, on an annual basis, the authority spends just over $1 million on apprentice training and about $600,000 on ongoing licensed pilot required training. And what you see here is some pilots training in a ship model facility, conduct a full mission bridge simulator, one of which we actually have in-house now in partnership with the BC Coast pilots. A little bit about the examination. The examination to become a pilot is one of the toughest a mariner will ever face. There are 3 exams, 2 written and an oral, and the first written paper is based on the requirements for a 500-ton master near coastal, and the second an intensive examination of the candidate's coastal knowledge, which is known as the local knowledge. And what you see here is one of 5 blank charts that are part of the local knowledge written exam. And I share this with you so that you can see what it looks like on completion. So what you see now is the completed version of that blank chart. And I'd like to point out to you that there are 6 marks to this one, and this candidate got 6 out of 6. So that's 6 marks out of a total of 100. The pass mark for the 2 written papers is 70, and the same for the orals. So let's now get back to the story at hand and the boarding of the inbound vessel with the pilot. So pilots board the vessel via a pilot launch or a helicopter via a wire hoist. Once on the bridge, the pilot will conduct a Bridge Resource Management Meeting, known as BRM, and discuss the passage plan, the vessel handling characteristics, and any equipment defects. In this instance, we know that the Inmarsat-C, a satellite communication system, has a problem, but it will not impact the passage to port. If, during the BRM, an additional defect is found, the pilots will call vessel traffic and report the defect, and will then wait for an answer from a Transport Canada marine inspector. If it is a major safety concern, such as no working radars or no gyro, as an example. Now, if TC says to take the ship to anchor and get the defect repaired, that is what we will do, with no arguments. But if they come back and say, you're good to go, we support it, it's still up to the pilot to make the final call about whether he feels he can do the job safely with that defect. So what I would like to emphasize here is that the Canadian Coast Guard, Transport Canada, and the Pilotage Authority through the pilots are all working together to ensure the safe movement of the vessel. One of the things that pilots do now that they didn't do over 10 years ago was to bring on board specialized equipment. And what you see in front of you now is a complete navigational aid system, namely the portable pilotage unit, which is the laptop or toughbook as you see there, a very sophisticated GPS system, and a rate of turn generator, which they all carry on board for the bridge. And one of the reasons for doing this is to ensure that even if the vessel has a power failure and blacks out, there is a workable, standalone navigation system to get that vessel safely to an anchorage. A question that is often asked is, how do we know who gives way to who when there are no traffic signals or roadways out there? It's done through an international document known as the Collision Regulations and puts rules in place for how vessels operate in various conditions and in relation to each other. Canada made some additional modifications that deal with specific Canadian issues, such as the requirements for vessels heading into the current to give way to vessels with the current, etc. in narrow waterways. The Turnpoint Special Operating Area, which you see on the slide now, was an additional level of safety developed jointly by the Canadian Coast Guard, Transport Canada, and the United States Coast Guard, with the marine industry and the pilots to address concerns that were raised in this area. It applies to vessels over 100 meters in length. They are not to enter the SOA, Special Operating Area, when another vessel over 100 meters is already in the SOA, unless they are 5 cables apart when traveling in the same direction. When overtaking, there must be no opposing traffic. And the closest point of approach is never to be more than 5 cables, half a mile. Vessels are required to wait until the other vessel in the SOA has cleared a predetermined position and there is a closest point of approach of at least half a mile, 5 cables. And they have to maintain a distance off of turn point of at least 3 cables, 0.3 of a mile. At this stage, I would also like to mention that in this area, Boundary Pass and Harris Strait, there is also an ECHO program which was set up by the Port of Vancouver along with its partners. And ECHO stands for Enhancing Cetacean Habitat and Observation, and was put in place to address the Species at Risk Act, SARA, concerns for the southern resident killer whales. There are a number of initiatives being addressed in the Conservation Agreement, and one such being the slowdown of vessels as they transit the area, namely Harris Strait and Boundary Pass. The slowdown usually starts in May or June, as soon as the southern resident killer whale pods are observed in the area, and will continue until they leave, which is usually around September. Last year, this was extended to November the 15th, as the pods remained in the area. As we approach Sandheads, the Fraser River pilot will be coming out in the pilot launch to take over from the coast pilot, who would have started slowing the vessel down about 20 to 40 minutes from Sandheads. Once the Fraser pilot boards, there will be a handoff of information between the 2 pilots and another bridge resource management conducted by the Fraser River pilot to ensure that the master and the bridge team are aware of the passage plan up the river and the hazards that they're going to encounter. The Fraser River pilot will have organized the tugs and will carry out all the maneuvers to safely dock the ship. And at this juncture, I will hand over to Eggy from the Port of Vancouver, as that's where the ship is. Eggy, over to you.
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, my name is Eggy Kloosterboer, and I'm with the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. So the Salinas is now entering the navigational jurisdiction of the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority. On the slide here, you can see an overview of the Port of Vancouver. The Port of Vancouver is home to 29 major terminals and able to handle the most diversified range of cargo in North America. Bulk and liquid bulk, such as the Salinas and the Aqua Leader, but also containers, break bulk, cars, and cruise. The darker blue area on the slide here shows you the boundaries of our navigational jurisdiction. Our navigational jurisdiction has 3 distinct areas. First, the Burrard Inlet. If you draw a line from Point Atkinson in West Vancouver south to UBC, and then it goes all the way to east to Port Moody. The second area is Roberts Bank, and this is where the Delta Port Terminal and the BC Ferries terminals are located. The third area is the Fraser River. This is where the Salinas is now sailing on our way to the final destination, the Fraser Surrey Docks Terminal. A question that I often hear is, what is a port authority? There are 18 port authorities in Canada, and they're established under the Canada Marine Act. And what a port authority does is clearly outlined in this act. The mandate of a Canada Port Authority is to facilitate Canada's trade objectives, ensuring that goods are moved safely while protecting the environment and considering local communities. And I'm here now to talk about what the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority does to achieve this mandate in our jurisdiction with respect to the inbound voyage of the Salinas, and later with the outbound voyage of the Aqua Leader through the Inner Harbor. First, I'm going to talk about maritime domain awareness. The definition of maritime domain awareness is the effective understanding of anything that could impact the security, safety, economy, or the environment. After domain awareness, I'm going to talk about practices and procedures which ships have to follow when they're in a jurisdiction. And I will talk specifically about traffic control zones that we have established. So while the Salinas is sailing in our jurisdiction, the Fraser River pilot is still on board, and MCTS is still providing vessel traffic services and is also communicating with the vessel. As a port, we are not monitoring the exact position of the Salinas, and we're also not communicating with the vessel directly, but instead we are focusing on domain awareness. We want to know the bigger picture of all the activities and events that are taking place in our waters. Simply said, we want to know what is going on in our port, and we want to make sure that the port is safe, remains safe, and that we can take immediately action if needed. On the top left of the slide, you can see a picture of our operations center, or what we call ROC. The operations center is located on Canada Place in Vancouver. It's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. This center is always staffed by a marine operations coordinator, and these are all experienced mariners. During office hours, we also have supporting staff from the land operations and the security departments. In the background of the picture, you can see many TV screens. The operations coordinator has hundreds of cameras to his or her availability, as well as several other domain awareness systems, such as AIS. Our operations center is the first point of contact for many stakeholders, such as vessels agents and terminals. The operations center is also the hub where we liaise with our colleagues of Transport Canada, the Coast Guard, MCTS and pilots, as well as other agencies such as police and fire departments. The operations coordinator is also the point of contact for another very important domain awareness tool that we have available, which is our harbor patrol. On the slide in the bottom, you can see two of our harbor patrol boats. We always have two harbor patrol boats on the water between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. One boat is stationed in the Fraser River and one boat is in the inner harbor. On alternating weeks, we also have a third boat on the water for either 3 or 4 days. Each harbor patrol vessel has 2 harbor patrol officers on board. So most of the time, we have 6 people on the water. Harbor patrol is our eyes and ears on the water, and they're often the first ones to arrive on a site when needed. In addition, they can provide escorts as well. So for example, if there are a lot of recreational or fishing boats in the vessel's way, like the Salinas, the harbor patrol can provide the Salinas with an escort. This means the harbor patrol boat will sail in front of the Salinas and clearing the way. We do this a lot, and especially we do this with cruise ships leaving the first Narrows. As I mentioned, the Port Authority can establish practices and procedures that have to be followed by ships. Here you can see in the red this very specific section of the Canada Marine Act which says, "A Port Authority may, for the purpose of promoting safe and efficient navigation or environmental protection of the waters of the port, with respect to ships or classes of ships, establish practices and procedures to be followed by ships." These practices and procedures are published in the Port Information Guide, and they are unique to our port. These practices and procedures, they do not replace the regulations and requirements of the agency that you just heard. Our regulations are extra. They're specifically developed for our port and therefore providing an additional layer of safety. The Port Information Guide itself is published on the Port Authority website. It's about 300 pages, but you do not have to be a master mariner to understand these regulations. They're easy readable, and we encourage you to have a look at the guide. It contains a lot of interesting information. As you can see in the next slide is under Section 56D of the Canada Marine Act, the Port Authority can establish traffic control zones. And I'm going to talk more now in detail about these traffic control zones. The purpose of a traffic control zone, or a TCZ, is to facilitate the safe navigation and efficient movement of vessels in specific areas of the port with constraints. For each of that specific area, we have a set of specific practices and procedures. These procedures were developed in close cooperation with the pilots as well as with MCTS. In our jurisdiction, we currently have 4 traffic control zones for the 4 most constrained areas. The oldest one is the second Narrows, TCZ2, formerly known as Movement Restricted Area, or MRA. This traffic control zone was originally established in the 80s. It was updated in 2008 and completely reviewed and updated again in 2016. Since 2016, we have a traffic control zone 1 for the first Narrows. I will talk more about these 2 specific traffic control zones later during the outbound voyage of the next vessel. Traffic control zone 3 for the Eastern Burrard Inlet, or third Narrows, was established in 2021. Traffic control zone 4 came into effect in 2018, and this one applies to the Fraser River. So this means that the Salinas has to comply with procedures of this traffic control zone. Because it's about 36 kilometers from Sandheads, where the Fraser River pilot boards, to the terminal at Fraser Surrey Docks, we have divided the river into these 4 sections. Each section gives very specific procedures for that specific section. All 4 sections in Traffic Control Zone 4 have in common that they provide transit windows, various traffic procedures such as the order of transit, overtaking, and safe distances between vessels. Traffic Control Zone 4 is also describing various restrictions such as speed, wind, and visibility restrictions, as well as specific communication procedures. Traffic Control Zone 4 is important because the Fraser River, we have a dredged navigation channel. I tried to capture this on the image on the right. In the bottom of the picture, you can see the dredged channel in the riverbed to make sure that the river is deep enough for a vessel, to make sure that the vessel has enough water under the keel. This dredged channel translates into a designed navigation channel, which you can see in the middle of the image. This navigation channel is published in navigational charts. But the Fraser River is a very dynamic river, and the riverbed is always changing. Therefore, the riverbed is continuously surveyed to make sure that we know exactly the condition of this channel and the actual water depths. This survey data is uploaded in the pilot's PPUs that Kevin mentioned to make sure that the pilots always have the latest and most accurate information available to safely navigate in the center of this channel, which is displayed in the top of the picture. So with the introduction of Traffic Control Zone 4 and with the Fraser River pilots complying with the procedures, the Salinas is now safely berthed alongside Fraser Surrey Docks. This means that I can take you now to our next vessel, the Aqua Leader. This outbound voyage gives me the opportunity to show you the difference in procedures between the various traffic control zones, as well as the additional safety regulations that apply to this tanker. Here's the Aqua Leader. It's a loaded Aframax tanker with a length of 250 meters and a width of 44 meters. The vessel is berthed alongside the Westridge Terminal in Burnaby, which is the Trans Mountain Terminal, and ready for departure. The vessel agent ordered 2 BC Coast pilots, and they're now coming on board to bring the vessel to open sea. And I said 2 pilots, not 1 pilot. And this is already the first difference with the Salinas. The Aqua Leader requires 2 pilots versus the Salinas having only 1 pilot. And I will show you later in the presentation why. So with the 2 pilots on board, the vessel is pulled off the dock by assist tugs. First, the vessel has to transit the second Narrows or Traffic Control Zone 2. On this slide, you can see the boundaries of Traffic Control Zone 2, within it a one-way channel in the center. Now the first thing the pilots will do is to contact MCTS, and they request a clear Narrows. A clear Narrows is a transit of a vessel unimpeded by any other vessel. So this means MCTS will not allow any other vessel in this traffic control zone, so that the pilots can focus 100% on the transit and navigation and not have to worry about other traffic. On this slide, you can see a picture of the second Narrows with the 2 bridges, the Ironworkers Memorial Bridge as well as the CN Railway Bridge. Beside this picture is an image of the same area, but now it's translated into the available navigational envelope. This image describes how we make sure that not only the navigation channel is wide enough for the aqua leader, but also that the vessel has enough water under the keel, as well as enough overhead clearance under the two bridges when transiting the second narrows. This image is published in the Port Information Guide. And now it's getting a little bit more technical. This slide is a compilation of the various tables, and they are also coming directly out of the Traffic Control Zone 2 procedures that are in the Port Information Guide. So in the table in the top of the slide, it's describing the navigational envelope image that I just showed, but now in numbers. So you can see that for this vessel of 44 meters wide, the channel width is 125.4 meters. The control depth at chart datum is 9.9 meters. And the maximum air draft is 41.8 meters. So with this table, the pilot can always make sure that the vessel stays within the navigational envelope. So in the table in the middle, you can see the transit requirements and transit restrictions that apply for this vessel. The aqua leader is longer than 185 meters and it's over 40,000 tons summer deadweight. In the first column, you can see that this vessel is not allowed to transit during the night, but transit in daytime only. The next two columns describe tidal current restrictions. This is a very important restriction. Depending if it's ebbing or flooding, the water flows in and out of the second narrows and is causing tidal currents. Large tidal currents are impacting the navigation. Therefore, we do not allow the aqua leader to transit during these tidal currents. The period between ebbing and flooding is called slack water, and that's when the tidal currents are minimum. As you can see in the table, we allow this vessel to transit with slack water only up to 1 knot opposing or half a knot following currents. Although the vessel will transit in the slack water window, we still require the vessel to have powerful tugs assisting during transit. The T in the third column means that these tugs need to be tethered, so they can start pulling immediately if needed. In the fourth column, you can see the pilot requirements that I mentioned earlier. The aqua leader is over 40,000 tons summer deadweight, and that's why we require 2 pilots on board. Now I go to the last table on the right in the bottom, where you can see the minimum tug capacity requirements. This vessel requires 1 or 2 tugs at the bow, as long as the combined bollard pull is minimum 60 tons. For the stern, the vessel requires minimum 2 tugs and a minimum of 110 bollard pull tons. These are very powerful tugs, and they will be capable to safely transit the aqua leader, even if the vessel encounters a power failure or a steering problem. After clearing the second narrows, the aqua leader will proceed to the first narrows, or Traffic Control Zone 1. On this slide, you can see the boundaries of Traffic Control Zone 1. Also, this Traffic Control Zone has one-way navigation channel in the middle. And also, for this transit, the pilot is required to request a clear narrows with MCTS. In this slide, you can see the same principle that has been applied to as was applied to Traffic Control Zone 2. You can see the image on the left with the picture, and we developed a navigational envelope with transit requirements for first narrows. The first narrows is wider and deeper than the second narrows. The Lionsgate Bridge is higher than the second narrows bridges, so there are less constraints for the aqua leader to transit. However, we do see a lot of larger container vessels and cruise vessels coming to Vancouver. These vessels are way too big to transit second narrows, but they are now pushing the navigational envelope for first narrows. Therefore, it is important to have Traffic Control Zone 1 procedures in place for these larger vessels. And this is a slide with the tables again for first narrows. The table on the right shows this navigational envelope is much wider compared to second narrows, and the table on the left shows the specific requirements for the aqua leader. And as you can see here, the vessel will still transit Traffic Control Zone 1 with tug assist on both the bow and the stern. Now, after completing the first narrow transit, the vessel will enter the English Bay routing system and leaving the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority navigational jurisdiction. However, the pilot is still on board, and therefore I hand it now back to Kevin. Thank you. Kevin?
Thanks, Eggy. And we're in the home stretch now, folks. So the reason that we present an outbound loaded tanker is to highlight the difference in the safety levels between a loaded tanker and what we would normally do with a freighter, such as a bulk carrier with a cargo of grain. For a bulk ship or a container ship, once it is safely off the dock, the tugs will be released and there'll be only one pilot to take the vessel from Vancouver to the Victoria Pilot Station. You previously heard from Eggy that there are 2 pilots through the port, as well as escort tugs on the tanker, and this continues after leaving the port. So there was another change as a result of fast time simulations and assessments, which resulted in additional safety measures being agreed to by the pilots, the agencies, and the marine industry. From about 3 miles to the northwest of East Point, there are 2 pilots required to be on the bridge, and the tug has to be tethered again. Vessel's maximum speed is restricted to 10 knots, and there has to be additional bridge staff available. At present, both pilots remain on the bridge until the vessel approaches the Victoria Station. So all the way through Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass, the tug will be tethered and there'll be 2 pilots on the bridge. At the station, the tug will be untethered and the pilots disembark. And the tug then runs with the tanker until it rounds Race Rocks, at which time it leaves. Once the Trans Mountain expansion is finalized and we are doing 1 tanker a day, there are more changes that are coming forward. When this happens, the vessel will pass by the station with the 2 pilots and will turn around off Race Rocks, heading towards the open waters in Juan de Fuca. The tugs will stay tethered until around the rotary, which is around the Race Rock area, and then will untether, but remain with the vessels as far as J-Buoy, which is at the conclusion of where it is the open water, and where you see on the slide the the blue and the red lines. The pilots will then get off somewhere in the vicinity of Souk. So this is very different from how we are handling other vessels departing southern BC. And that is the differences between the tankers and the other non-tanker vessels. And I'm going to hand us back now to Daniel as we have come to the end. Daniel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Great, so now we have come to the end of our story, with the Aqualeader heading out to sea, having safely navigated the waters of the Salish Sea and the Juan de Fuca. We hope that by following the inbound and outbound journeys of these vessels, you've learned more about how incidents are prevented in Canadian waters, as well as the importance of cooperation between various agencies in Canada.